Hello everyone and welcome back to Hour of Devastation Limited Review Week. I'm Nitsuhone and I'm in the midst of a 6-part Hour of Devastation full set limited review. Yesterday I covered white and today I'm continuing with blue. The other colors will be coming out as the week progresses. Before we get started with the first blue card in Hour of Devastation, here's a quick reminder on how I grade these cards. If you have already seen this, you can skip ahead to the first card by following a timestamp in the description below. Just like with Anointed, I'm using letter grades to help me to explain how good I think these cards will be in the new format, and I will provide a letter grade for every card after discussing each of them. These grades are an easy way of summing up what I have to say about the card, and have to do with how highly I can see myself taking them. To help convey what each of these grades mean, I'm going to provide examples of cards from Anointed that I think deserve each of these letter grades. Let's start with A. Cards that are in A are bombs, an incredibly efficient removal, and are the kind of cards that you want to be first picking, or are so powerful that they pull you into their color. There are not a ton of A's in any format, and I'm pretty stingy with them. They are the best cards in the set, and the vast majority of them are mythic or rare, though occasionally uncommons make it into the A range. Some examples of A's from Anointed are cards like Angel of Sanctions and Glorybringer. These two cards are insane, and so powerful that they can win games on their own, both providing large flying bodies and the ability to remove other creatures, making them very powerful. Next, let's look at B's. These cards are obviously not quite as good as A's, but are still very good and are, in cases where there isn't a huge A-level bomb in the pack, still cards I'm happy to take with a first pick or an early pick. These are very good removal spells and very efficient creatures with powerful abilities. They aren't quite as game or draft warping as A's are, but seeing them past pick 4 or 5 is a pretty good signal that a color is open and for you to jump into it. Most B's are of uncommon rarity or higher, though occasionally commons can make it into the B range as well. Some examples of B's from Anointed are Oncrop Crasher and Angler Drake. These cards are very powerful and can help shift the game in your favor and are good at any stage of the game, but they aren't cards that completely warp a game when they are played, like, let's say, Angel of Sanctions or Glorybringer. Still, both of these cards are cards I'm happy to first pick and ecstatic to get any later than that. Next, we have C's. This is what the vast majority of cards in a set are, and they appear at every rarity with regularity. Solid and playable cards that you neither feel good or bad about having in your deck is sort of the definition of a C. These are decent creatures like 2-mana 2/2s with some small upside and solid removal. Some examples of C's from Anointed are cards like Colossopede, just a 5-mana 5/5, sure, it's fine, and Cursed Minotaur, a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace. These are both cards that you feel fine about having in your deck, but you don't exactly feel excited about. From there, we move to D's. These are cards that are playable, but just barely, and are cards that you generally aren't happy to have in your deck. They usually only end up there when something went wrong in your draft, like being unsure about what colors you should be in so you don't end up with enough playables, and thus you're forced into playing cards of this level. There were actually a lot of D's in Anointed because cycling made what would otherwise be F's into D's. Some examples of D's are Violent Impact and Watchers of the Dead. Neither of them really does enough to be card you're excited about having in your deck. Watchers of the Dead is a 2-mana 2/2 with no real upside, and Violent Impact is a bad artifact removal spell that happens to have cycling. You'll play them when you have to, but you don't really want to. Finally, we have F's. These are cards that I think you should never ever put into your deck and are terrible. Just like there aren't many A's in this set, there usually aren't many F's, but they are always around. Weirdly, there are actually a decent number of rares and mythics in this category, since they often like printing unique and strange effects on cards of that rarity. Some examples of S from Anointed are Glorious End, just is a terrible card. Any card that says you lose the game on it is probably not something you want to play. You had to end up in a very narrow situation for it to actually work. You had to cast it on your opponent's turn and be able to kill them on your next turn, otherwise you just lose. And Hazoret's Monument, just basically does nothing. You don't really want to be playing the card. It doesn't have a big enough impact on the game. It's not worth the card in general. In addition to these more clear-cut grades, there are also two categories of cards that I will present more than one grade for. The first of these are sideboard cards. These are cards that generally you don't want to have in your main board. They're either a D or an F if they're in your main board, but they are better in certain matchups out of your sideboard. An example of this from Anointed is Stinging Shot. It is a D in your main board, since it will frequently never have a target and just get cycled, but out of your sideboard, it gets all the way into the B range because it is incredibly efficient removal for dealing with flyers. The other cards I will present two grades for are build-around cards. These are cards that are generally a D or an F in your average limited deck, but if you manage to get enough synergies, they become much better. An example of this from Anointed would be Nest of Scarabs, an unplayable card in basically any limited deck, But if you end up with 10 or more ways to make -1/-1 counters, it moves all the way into the C+ and B- range. One last thing before getting into the actual discussion of the cards is a few caveats. These grades are all based on my first impressions of the cards, as obviously I haven't had a chance to play with any of them since they were spoiled. These impressions are based on years of playing Magic and drafting a ton, and it is likely, even definite, that I'll be wrong about some of these cards, as it is impossible to judge a card without actually playing it. With Unquenchable, I went back and provided new grades for about 10% of the cards a few weeks after my initial limited review, and I had a chance to play with the cards, and I think a rate like that is about right. No one can perfectly predict how a limited format will play out. You have to play it to get the best understanding. Still, this is where these cards stand for me at the moment, and over time I will provide more grades for cards that have changed over time for me. Now let's go ahead and get started. First card we have to look at is Aerial Guide, which is 2 generic and 1 blue mana for a 2/2 Drake at common with flying, and whenever Aerial Guide attacks, another target attacking creature gains flying until end of turn. I like this card a lot. I actually think it's strong enough that it should have been an uncommon maybe, and I think maybe it was at one point in the testing process, but they realized blue was weak, so they bumped down the rarity on this thing because it is very good. It's basically Windrake with a ton of upside, and Windrake is a solid card in most formats, and like I said, this is miles better than Windrake. This is because it represents far more than 2 damage in the air like your average Windrake. It can also give flying to one of your ground creatures and speed up the clock. Even if you're just giving a 2/2 or a 3/3 flying and getting in with it, that's a big deal, but this also includes making huge creatures, or creatures who are exerting themselves, flyers until end of turn, something that can result in massive amounts of damage. This is the kind of common that might go a long way towards powering up blue compared to where it was in triple Amonkhet. I'm willing to give this thing a B-, meaning I'm willing to first pick it in some packs and definitely want to take it early. Next we have Evenread Stalker, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a bird warrior and a 2/3 with flash and flying at common. 4 mana for a 2/3 with flash and flying isn't bad, but it isn't really good either. Creatures with flash do come with some upside, it's worth noting, especially in decks packing a lot of instant speed cards or mana sinks like cycling, as you can leave the mana up for this creature, see what your opponent does, and then decide what you want to do with that mana at a better time with more information. Sometimes creatures with flash can also ambush creatures, and flashing this in to eat a 2/2 is not the most far-fetched thing in the world. This isn't the kind of card you want in every blue deck, though. It just doesn't do enough. It's not a big enough body. It's not efficient enough. And I think it'll end up getting cut a decent percentage of the time, so I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Champion of Wits, which is a rare for 2 generic and 1 blue. It's a Naga Wizard, a 2/1, and it says when Champion of Wits enters the battlefield, you may draw cards equal to its power. If you do, discard 2 cards. It also has Eternalize. This is the first time in this video we're seeing it, so I will read the reminder text here, but I will not for the rest of the Eternalize cards in this video. It has an Eternalize cost of 5 generic and 2 blue, and that means you can exile the card from your graveyard and create a 4/4 black zombie creature token that's a copy of this creature, and you can only Eternalize as a sorcery. I really like the design of most Eternalized cards, but I don't love this one in terms of its limited power level. 3 mana for a 2/1 is a pretty bad rate, and yes, you do get to loot twice at least, meaning you can get rid of some lands, or maybe discard a card with graveyard value for some more impactful cards off the top of your library, and it has Eternalize, which means in the late game it comes out of your graveyard, but for 7 mana. Granted, it is a 4/4 that draws you 4 cards and you discard 2. The Eternalized part on this card is pretty freaking strong, but it's really expensive too. On the whole, this card is a fine blue playable, but there will be lots of games where you never get to Eternalize, so it basically comes down to being a 3 mana 2/1 that lets you dig a little deeper into your deck. Certainly not a bad card, but not really an exciting one either. I'm only going to give it a C. Don't go out of your way to take it, don't overrate it because of its rarity. It's a solid card, but it's nothing special. Next, we're looking at Countervailing Winds, which for 2 generic and 1 blue mana is an instant at common that says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard, and it also has cycling for 2 generic mana, and cycling means you can discard the card, pay its cost, and draw a card. In this case, the cost is 2 generic mana. I'm never a huge fan of counter magic. If you've heard me talk about it already, forgive me for saying it again, but don't think about counter magic as removal. This is a big mistake that I think people make. With removal, your opponent can play a creature, and you don't have to have the mana up to deal with it immediately. You can have the removal spell in your hand, wait till you untap, and then kill the creature. With counter magic, you have to have the mana up for it to do anything. This counterspell also asks you to fill up your graveyard, which isn't a huge hurdle in this format, to be fair, because of a mechanic like cycling, but it still means this card is going to be dead a lot of the time. It does come with the added bonus of cycling itself, which does decrease the downside of the card a little bit, since you can just cycle it away when it's not doing anything. Even with cycling, though, I find it hard to imagine wanting to play this card in most decks and going out of my way to take it, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Cunning Survivor, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 1/3 human warrior at common that says, whenever you cycle or discard a card, Cunning Survivor gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. This is a pretty nice card for cycling heavy decks as it provides a source of inevitable damage. Getting in for 2 a few times with this can go a long way towards helping you win a game, and in the meantime, the Cunning Survivor is an okay-ish 2-mana 1/3, which can at least slow down 2/2s. He definitely needs a cycling deck to be at his best, but the floor on the card isn't super low either, so I'm going to give him a solid C. Most blue decks will have enough cycling to take advantage of Cunning Survivor. Next, we have Eternal of Harsh Truths, which for 2 generic and 1 blue mana is a zombie cleric at uncommon with Afflict 2. First time we've seen Afflict, a new mechanic in Hour of Devastation, and basically what it means is when the creature is blocked, it does that much damage, in this case 2, to the opponent, and actually it's loss of life, not damage, but which does matter sometimes. And it has, whenever Eternal of Harsh Truths attacks and isn't blocked, draw a card. 3 mana for a 1/3 isn't very good, but this thing has a lot of stuff going on that makes it worth playing for me. Afflict 2 means that if your opponent just has a 2/2 that can block it all day, they're still going to lose life, and if they choose they would rather just get hit by the Eternal, you get to draw a card. I like cards with Afflict that make your opponent choose between 2 unattractive options, and that's definitely what we have going on here. This is a solid playable for blue decks. I'm going to give it a solid C. Next, we have Fraying Sanity. For 2 generic and 1 blue mana, it's an enchantment or a curse at rare, and it says Enchant Player. At the beginning of each instep, Enchanted Player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. This is pretty terrible, at least in Limited. There really isn't a dedicated milling a deck around in this format. There's a bit of a sub-theme maybe. Otherwise, maybe this would be a little better. Instead, you're probably only going to be milling 1 to 2 cards a turn, and sometimes none, depending on what your opponent is doing. Basically, in the long run of a game, you're paying 3 mana for a blank card. So don't play this. It's an absolute F. Next, we have Hour of Eternity, which is XX in 3 blue mana for a sorcery at rare, and it says exile X target creature cards from your graveyard. For each card exiled this way, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. Essentially, it eternalizes X cards in your graveyard. When I first saw this card, I thought it would most certainly be an F. But the more I've looked at it, the better I've thought it would be. If you pay 7 mana, you get 8/8 worth of power out of your graveyard from only 1 card, and that is probably going to be the amount of mana to pay to get the best bang for your buck out of this card. Still, 7 mana is a lot, and the triple blue on this thing doesn't even guarantee it will be easy to cast. However, if you have a grindy control deck with lots of blue in it, I don't see why you wouldn't want to play this. Most decks should steer clear, but not all, and I'm going to give this a D+. Next, we have Imaginary Threats, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an instant at uncommon that says, creatures target opponent controls attack this turn if able. During that player's next untap step, creatures he or she controls don't untap. Cycling for 2 mana. This is a card that I think I overlooked in the video I did for the Ether Hub when talking about blue's best uncommons. This probably should have made the list. This does a lot of work. For 4 mana, you can make your opponent's creatures attack. This can sometimes just result in you decimating their board because you just have better blockers. And the creatures that you don't kill in combat aren't going to be untapping. So you're going to end up with a total of 2 attack phases when your opponent's creatures are tapped down. This can go a very long way towards just ending a game because suddenly your opponent's creatures can't stop yours. It also comes with cycling, which means that if you draw this on a board state where you can take advantage, you can always cycle it. And there are lots of payouts for cycling in this format too. I don't quite think this makes it into the B range because it's only good in a board state where you're sort of in stall out mode and your opponent's creatures are smaller than yours, but I do think it's a solid C+, a card that will fit well into most blue decks, whether more aggressive or tempo-based or spell-heavy decks. Next, we have Jace's Defeat, the second card in this cycle we've been looking at. Jace's Defeat is 1 generic and 1 blue for an instant uncommon. It says counter target blue spell. If it was a Jace Planeswalker spell, scry 2. So, just like Gideon's Defeat, Jace's Defeat is going to be terrible in your main board. It's an absolute F in your main board. You can't guarantee your opponent's going to have blue spells. You can't guarantee they're going to be playing blue, and so it's very dangerous to put this in your main board. You could, of course, get very lucky and play against 3 people playing blue, and then it feels great, but that's not what's going to happen most of the time. But if you are playing against someone who's playing blue, this becomes a very powerful counterspell. I mentioned earlier I don't normally like counter magic, and this is true, but this is a hard counter, and it only costs 2 mana. So leaving the mana up for it isn't difficult. Obviously, the Jace part of this is going to be trinket text in this format. There's not a Jace Planeswalker in this format. But it's still a good card out of your sideboard, and if you're playing against someone who's playing blue, side this in and it'll be worth a B in your deck. It'll be a very good card. Next, we have Kefnet's Last Word, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a sorcery that says, gain control of target artifact, creature, or enchantment. Lands you control don't untap during your next untap step. Stealing a permanent for 4 mana is incredibly good. One way to think of cards that steal your opponent's permanents is to think of them as saying, destroy a target creature and put a copy of it into play on your side, because that's basically what they do, and that is a huge swing. Like all cards in this cycle, this comes with big downside of not letting your lands untap on your next untap step. However, this effect is game-breaking. Stealing your opponent's best permanent is going to win a lot of games, even if your lands don't untap, especially if you have 8 or 9 lands in play and you only tap 4 of them for this spell. Like all of these cards, it is a bit of a liability to cast early, but by mid and late game, this thing is a powerhouse, and I'm willing to give it a B-, meaning I'm willing to first pick it in some packs, downside and all. Next, we have Nimble Obstructionist. 2 generic and 1 blue for a bird wizard who's a 3/1 at rare with flash and flying, and cycling for 2 generic and 1 blue, and it says, when you cycle Nimble Obstructionist, counter target activated or triggered ability you don't control. A 3 mana, 3/1 with flash and flying is already a pretty good deal, and on its own would be a solid playable. Creatures with flash can sometimes ambush creatures and become removal spells, as we mentioned earlier. This comes as a bit of a split card, though. For 3 mana, you can turn it into a can-tripping Stifle, meaning it counters an activated or triggered ability, and that's pretty nice. Activated and triggered abilities are all over the place, and there will be times when this comes up big. The flexibility of this card, coupled with the fact that it is a nice beater in the air for a reasonable mana cost, pushes this card up to B- for me. It isn't insane, and it won't usually be first pickable, but it is a good card that I'm willing to take around pick 3 or 4 and feel pretty good about. Next, we have Ominous Sphinx, which for 3 generic and 2 blue mana is a Sphinx. At uncommon, a 4/4 with flying, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, target creature an opponent controls gets -2, -0 until end of turn. 5 mana 4/4 flyers are always good and limited, and this comes with the added bonus of having a cycling payoff. Cycling is all over the place in this format, as we've already seen, and the ability to shrink creatures' power when you cycle stuff is pretty nice. It can make combat really frustrating for your opponent, and just the threat of a Sphinx activation can prevent some attacks since the opponent doesn't see a point in risking it. Just holding a few cards in your hand can bluff your opponent into not attacking you. This is one of the better uncommons in the set, and I think it is worth first picking between being an efficient beater in the air and having some very powerful upside, so that means it's a B. Next, we have Proven Combatant, which is 1 blue mana for a human warrior and a 1/1 at common with Eternalize for 4 and 2 blue. This card's not good. 1 mana 1/1s have a hard time being good and limited because their usefulness quickly evaporates. Sure, in the late game, you can pay 6 mana to get a 4/4 out of your graveyard, but that's not a very good rate either. You can't really count on the 1/1 body of this having traded with something in the early game to actually make it feel like a 2-for-1. Normally, you're just going to be chump blocking something with this. It is nice that unlike most 1 mana 1/1s, it brings you a little more value in the late game, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's ever going to be worth playing, and I'm going to give it an F. Next, we have Riddle Form. This is 1 generic and 1 blue for an enchantment at uncommon that says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may have Riddle Form become a 3/3 Sphinx creature with flying, in addition to its other types until end of turn, and it also has 2 generic and a blue scry 1. I think this card goes a long way towards improving decks that run a ton of non-creature spells in this format. In Triple Amonkhet, it could be a bit of a liability not to play enough creatures, but Riddle Form is nice because it provides you with a pretty beefy attacker in the air every turn that you play a non-creature spell. You can also animate it at instant speed and use it to block something. It also allows you to scry, which synergizes well since you can make sure you hit instants and sorceries a little better if you're able to scry. This card is definitely something of a build-around, though, because of the fact that you probably need at least 10 non-creature spells to fully take advantage of it, and this isn't going to be where most decks end up outside of blue-red decks. If you don't have enough creature spells, steer clear of playing it. It's an F. But if you do have 10 or more non-creature spells, it pushes all the way into the C+ range. Next, we have Seer of the Last Tomorrow, which for 2 generic and 1 blue is a Naga Cleric and a 1/4 at common, and it has the activated ability of 1 blue mana, tap it, and discard a card. Target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So there's definitely something of a milling sub-theme within blue in this format, as I mentioned earlier, and if you pile enough of the blue commons and uncommons that mill, you might actually find yourself with a mill deck, maybe. I still don't have a real belief in it. It is also worth noting that you can just mill yourself with Seer of the Last Tomorrow and cards like it in an attempt to get some Eternalize, Embalm, or Aftermath into your graveyard. It also gives you a discard trigger. All that said, most decks should steer clear of this, apart from the most dedicated discard or mill decks, which I do think will be maybe possible in this format, though not a regular occurrence, and I'm going to give this a D. Next, we have Sinuous Striker. Sinuous Striker is an uncommon for 2 generic and a blue, and a Naga Warrior, a 2/2 creature, and it has pay 1 blue mana. Sinuous Striker gets +1/-1 until end of turn. It also has Eternalize for 3 generic, 2 blue, and you have to discard a card. A 3 mana 2/2 who can pump its power is an alright card already, probably around a D or a D+. Adding Eternalize pushes this card into solid playable territory though. In the early part of the game it has a solid chance of trading with something, thanks to at least having 2 power and 3 when it needs to. And then in the later game it can come back as a 4/4 who can pump itself all the way to a 7/1. That's a pretty problematic attacker. Adding discard to its Eternalize cost is a little bit of a problem, but if your deck has other cards with Eternalize, or you're just drawing extra lands, you can turn it into an advantage. Or, you know, negate the disadvantage anyway. This card is basically just filler, solid playable for your blue decks, but nothing special. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Spellweaver Eternal, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a common creature, a 2/1, a zombie Naga wizard, one of those 3 creature type creatures. It has prowess, which means whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, or actually any non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1. It also has afflict 2, which means the opponent will take 2 damage anytime they block it. This card has a lot going on for only 2 mana. We have seen 2 mana 2/1s with prowess be playable before, and this one brings the extra value of afflict with it. Prowess creatures are already a nightmare to block in combat because they can always get pumped by your opponent at instant speed. Adding afflict to the mix makes it even more of a pain because if you block hoping to kill the Eternal and then it gets pumped to toughness or 2 and survives, you just lost 2 life for nothing. Even if the Eternal does die in combat, you get some decent value by doing 2 to your opponent while also trading with one of their creatures. This is a high quality and surprisingly aggressive common for blue, and the kind of 2-drop any blue deck would be happy to play. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Strategic Planning, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a sorcery that says, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This is a pretty good card in terms of card selection, reminding me a lot of Anticipate, which was a solid playable in spell-based decks when we've seen it in Limited. And we know that the blue-red spells deck in this format has special interest in the graveyard too. While the format is in general is graveyard heavy, so generally putting the cards in your graveyard isn't necessarily going to be a downside. You could turn it into an upside. Not being instant speed is a bit of a hit, but I think control decks in this format, especially blue-red, will be happy to have a copy of this somewhere in their main board, so I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Striped Riverwinder, which for 6 generic and 1 blue mana is a 5/5 serpent at common. It has hexproof, and it has cycling for 1 blue. 7 mana for a 5/5, even with hexproof, is kind of a steep cost. But as we saw in Amonkhet, creatures who had cycling and were decent late-game threats, like River Serpent and Greater Sandworm, for example, ended up being better than they looked. And I think that will also be true of Striped Riverwinder. If you get it in your opening hand, it should most certainly be cycled, but if you get it in the late game, it is a very large creature for this format, and one who can't be targeted by your opponent's removal spells. The fact that it can be good in both the early and the late game means this is a solid playable that any blue deck will play. It's just filler, really, but it's solid filler, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Supreme Will, which for 2 generic and 1 blue is an instant, and it says, choose 1. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 generic mana. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put 1 of them in your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. In this block, Wizards has done a fairly good job of printing counter spells that are actually playable, with things like Censor and Essence Scatter in the last set. This is another one that is playable, thanks to the fact that it is basically a split card. It can be a counter spell when you need it to be, and it can be a very good source of card selection when you need it to be. Counter spells can be dangerous to play in Limited because, again, you have to leave the mana up for it to actually do something, and usually it's going to be better to just play a permanent than to leave your mana up. This can be especially devastating when your opponent correctly guesses you have the counter spell and can play around it. Additionally, Supreme Will is not a hard counter, and the longer the game goes on, the more likely it is to lose its value. However, adding the additional ability to it of allowing you to look at the top 4 cards of your library and put 1 into your hand, sort of a super anticipate for 1 more mana, makes this much better. In the early game, you can use it to just sort of snipe one of your opponent's spells, and in the late game, you can use it to find whatever it is you need. This card isn't incredibly strong, don't get me wrong. It is 3 mana for an effect that frequently won't impact the board, and if Amonkhet is any indication, this format is probably going to be fairly fast. That said, I think most blue decks would be fine having a copy of this, and they shouldn't go after it early, though. I'm going to give it another C. That's a lot of Cs. Next, we have Swarm Intelligence, which for 6 generic and 1 blue is an enchantment at rare, and it says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This is the kind of super fun card that seems mostly aimed at kitchen table magic and EDH. It is a 7-mana card that does nothing to impact the board immediately. Not really what you want to be doing at that stage of the game. I mean, it would be sweet to actually pull something off with this card, and you might occasionally do some heinous things. But most of the time, if you're trying to play this card, you're probably going to lose. I don't recommend playing it at all. It is too slow to be a worthwhile build-around, so I'm giving it an F. Next, we have Tragic Lesson, which for 2 generic and a blue is an instant at common that says, draw 2 cards, then discard a card unless you return a land you control to its owner's hand. This seems like a fine card draw spell to me. Returning land to your hand is often going to be worth drawing 2 cards at instant speed for 3 mana. You also have the option to just discard a card instead, and discarding does have some upside in this format between Eternalize, Aftermath, Embalm, and all the discard triggers that are around. This is going to be a solid card for blue decks in the format, especially those that are more spell-based, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Unesh, Cryo-Sphinx Sovereign, which for 4 generic and 2 blue, at Mythic, is a legendary creature Sphinx and a 4/4 with flying. And it says, Sphinx spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. Also says, whenever Unesh, Cryo-Sphinx Sovereign, or another Sphinx enters the battlefield under your control, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So for purposes of limited, most of the time the extra Sphinx synergy this thing can bring is not going to be relevant. Yes, occasionally you'll get another Sphinx. There aren't any below uncommon though, and most of them are rare or higher, so it isn't going to happen very often. But let's just look at Unesh on its own. It's a 6-mana 4/4 flyer that draws you at least 1 card. I'm in for that all the way, and usually it's going to draw you at least 2 cards. It can help you load up your hand while winning the game in the sky, and while not quite a amazing game-breaking bomb, I think the value that it brings you plus its size is enough for it to be sort of a low-level bomb, which means I'm willing to give it an A-. I'm willing to first pick this card in the majority of booster packs. If you actually end up getting to use its Enter the Battlefield trigger, its Sphinx trigger more than once, you're just going to win. So, I mean, there's no way you lose. That means, by the way, you can blink Unesh to use the ability a second time, or you can just play another Sphinx. But yeah, Unesh is great. One of the best cards in blue in this format, if not the best blue card in this format. Let's move on to Unquenchable Thirst. 1 generic and 1 blue mana for an enchantment aura at common with enchant creature, and it says, whenever Unquenchable Thirst enters the battlefield, if you control a desert, or there is a desert card in your graveyard, tap enchanted creature. Then it says, enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This is kind of a mediocre removal spell in a deck with 0 deserts. These sorts of effects blue gets are never great when they don't also tap the creature down. It's an okay removal spell if you're desperate, the kind that you will play in a pinch because your other color didn't provide you with the removal spells that you needed. So with 0 deserts, I think this is like a D+, which isn't very good. However, if your deck has a few deserts in it, this card becomes much, much better because now it actually taps the creature down at the same time, and I think gets it all the way into the B- range. It's a pretty huge range based on if you have a few deserts in your deck. I think the upside on this card is enough that it'll be worth taking relatively early and making sure you get the deserts later on for it to be at its best. Next, we have Unsummon, a card we've seen, 20 times. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant at common, and it says, return target creature to its owner's hand. Like I said, this card we've seen tons of times, and it's always decent. 1 mana to bounce a creature at instant speed is fine, especially if you manage to cast it in response to an aura or a combat trick, because in those cases, you're actually getting a card of value out of Unsummon. Even when you're not trading with it, though, Unsummon can give you a massive tempo boost. Bouncing a 5-drop for 1 mana feels pretty good. Any blue deck will play a few of these, and I'm going to give it a C as a reflection of that. Next, we have Vizier of the Anointed, which for 3 generic and 1 blue mana is an uncommon human cleric, a 2/4, and it says, when Vizier of the Anointed enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with Eternalize or Embalm, put that card into your graveyard, and then shuffle your library. Also, it says, whenever you activate an Eternalize or Embalm ability, draw a card. I'm going to be upfront here and tell you that this is like my favorite card in the set, the one I'm the most looking forward to playing. So maybe I'm a little biased, but I don't think I am. It's a very good card. 4 mana for a 2/4 is only a little more than you'd want to pay. And this card comes with a pretty strong ability, allowing you to throw a creature with Embalm or Eternalize into your graveyard when it comes into play. This effect alone is close enough to saying draw a card, since cards with Embalm, Eternalize can be thought of, sort of, as additional cards once they're in your graveyard, since you can cast them from there as if they were in your hand almost. But on top of that, each time you Eternalize or Embalm anything, you get to draw another card. That is a super powerful source of card advantage, and obviously it gets better the more Embalm and Internalize you have, but most people are actually going to end up with 4 or 5 cards with those abilities anyway, and in those decks it's going to be good, but it's going to get incredible and be an amazing engine when you really get a lot of Embalm and Internalize. I'm going to give this a B, making it a solid first pick and the kind of card I'm excited to have in my deck. Well, that's the last blue card in Hour of Devastation. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you disagree with any of my ratings, let me know in the comments. Discussing those things will be better for all of us and help us improve at this format. Also, if you want to make sure you see the rest of this limited review, as well as a bunch of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, I'll be back with my ratings for every black card in Hour of Devastation. Starting with Hour of Devastation, I have teamed up with 5colorcombo.com to improve drafting on their app. My card ratings are now used to help determine when the AI should select the card, so the app has become much more realistic in terms of draft. So it is a great way to prepare for the format. Go check it out at 5colorcombo.com. You can find a link in the description below.